Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. On November 5, 2024, the US citizens will elect their next president. The election in USA has raised considerable excitement among Indian audience as well, and hence IGPP has begun an educational series to introduce the audience to the various facets of the electoral procedure and reflect on the issues that are important to the American voters. The program would further reflect upon the consequences of the voters' choice on the larger world with particular focus on India and highlight the role played by Indian and other diaspora communities in the US election. In this series, today we explore how the two-party system emerged in the US and the founding principles of the Republican and Democratic Party. In our ongoing series about the US presidential election, today we are going to discuss the two-party system in the USA. The American political system, as we know it today, is deeply rooted in history, dating back to the early days of the nation. To understand how we got here, let's rewind to the aftermath of the American Revolution. The newly formed United States was facing a fundamental question. How should this vast and diverse nation be governed? George Washington, the first president of the US, warned against the dangers of political parties in his farewell address. Despite this, the political landscape of the 1790s witnessed the emergence of two distinct factions, the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. Alexander Hamilton, a visionary leader and proponent of a strong central government, spearheaded the Federalist movement. He believed in a robust treasury, a flourishing financial sector, a powerful national army, and a political executive representing all states. Hamilton's ideas were deeply influenced by the success of the British imperial system. On the other side of the spectrum was Thomas Jefferson, a southern plantation owner from Virginia. Jefferson prioritized state sovereignty over federal authority, fearing that too much power in the hands of a centralized government would jeopardize individual liberties and local interest. Hamilton's approach mirrored that of the British Empire, emphasizing a strong financial sector and centralized economic policies. Jefferson, however, believed in empowering local interest in agrarian communities, fearing the risk associated with speculative financial ventures. He held a strong opinion that agriculture would be the mainstay of American society. His preference was for political power to reside with individuals and their legislatures, not in the central government. These foundational disagreements laid the groundwork for what would become the two-party system in the United States, shaping the course of American politics for centuries to come. By the mid-19th century, with the decline of Federalist, the Democratic Republican Party existed less as a united political group than as a loose coalition of personal and sectional factions. The fissures in the party were fully exposed by the election of 1824, when the leaders of the two major factions, Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams, were both nominated for president. In the election, despite that Andrew Jackson received the majority of the popular vote, John Quincy Adams became the president. Following the election, the Democratic Republicans split into two major groups. The National Republicans, who became the nucleus of the Whig Party in the 1830s and were led by John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, while the Democratic Republicans were organized by Martin Van Buren and were led by Andrew Jackson. In 1829, when Andrew Jackson finally took over the US presidency, the national politics polarized around Jackson and his opposition, and two parties grew out of the old Republican Party. The Democratic Republicans, or Democrats, adhering to Jackson, and the National Republicans, or Whigs, opposing him. The Whig Party mainly focused on opposing the policies of Andrew Jackson. Modelled after the British Whigs, who opposed absolute monarchy, the Whig Party accused Jackson of executive overreach and often referred to him as King Andrew. On the other hand, the Jacksonian Democrats painted the Whigs as a party of wealthy northern elites who wanted to sidestep the will of the people. The Democrats and the Whigs were the first to adopt party-based customs in the Senate. In the 1830s, for example, members of the two parties began sitting on the opposite sides of the Senate chamber, with the Democrats gathering to the right of the presiding officer and the Whigs to the left. The party in the majority controlled the chairmanships and a majority of seats on most, if not all, of the standing committees. In the 1840s, each party began determining committee assignments of their members and submitted lists of assignments to be approved by the full Senate. However, we are aware that the Whig Party no longer exists, and it was the question of slavery that led to its demise. In 1849, California petitioned to join the Union as a free state, which threatened to upset the delicate power balance between free and slave-holding states. So was introduced the Compromise of 1850, a series of 5 bills which welcomed California as a free state, but also strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act that legally required northern states to prosecute and return runaway slaves. The Compromise of 1850, signed into law, was immediately and widely unpopular with both northern and southern Whigs, who each had their own grievances. The divisive slavery issue came to a head again in 1854 with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which authorized new territories and states to decide for themselves if they wanted to allow slavery. Anti-slavery Whigs, deciding that their party wasn't sufficiently committed to halting the spread of slavery, splintered off and formed the Republican Party along with the anti-slavery Democrats. Among the former prominent Whigs who turned Republican were Thomas Stevens, William Seward, and Abraham Lincoln. At their first presidential nomination convention in 1856, the Republicans nominated John C. Fremont on a platform that called on Congress to abolish slavery in territories, reflecting a widely held view in the North. Although ultimately unsuccessful in his presidential bid, Fremont carried 11 northern states and received nearly 2/5 of the electoral vote. During the first 4 years of its existence, the party rapidly displaced the Whigs as the main opposition to the dominant Democratic Party. In 1860, the Democrats split over the slavery issue, as the northern and southern wings of the party nominated different candidates. Thus, the single Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, was able to capture the presidency, winning 18 northern states and receiving 60% of the electoral vote, but only 40% of the popular vote. By the time of Lincoln's inauguration as president, however, 7 southern states had seceded from the Union, and the country soon descended into the American Civil War. While this is the brief history of the two major parties and the two-party system in the US, there have also been attempts at organizing third parties. The Know-Nothing Party, also known as the American Party, rose to prominence in the 1850s. With a secretive and anti-immigrant agenda, they opposed immigration, particularly from Catholic countries, earning their moniker from their cryptic response to inquiries, "I know nothing." The Populist Party or People's Party emerged in the 1890s, representing the interest of farmers and laborers. Advocating for reform such as free silver coinage and direct election of senators, they challenged the status quo and left an indelible mark on the American political discourse. In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt led the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party, in a crusade for progressive reforms. Their agenda included women's suffrage, workers' rights, and other progressive ideals, leaving a lasting impact on the course of American politics. In 2024, we have a very large set of third-party candidates, ranging from true independents like Professor Cornel West to established minor party candidates like Green Party stalwart Jill Stein to people on the periphery of the major parties such as former Democrat Robert Kennedy Jr. However, a third party or independent candidate has never won the presidential election in the US. One of the key benefits of the two-party system is stability. With only two major parties, the political landscape remains relatively predictable, providing voters with a sense of stability in their choices. Simplicity is another advantage. In a two-party system, voters can easily identify the two main parties and their platforms, simplifying the decision-making process during elections. Moreover, the two-party system ensures majority rule, as one of the two parties typically secure a majority in the legislature, enabling more effective governance. However, the two-party system also presents its share of challenges. One significant drawback is the limited choice available to voters. With only two main parties, main issues and viewpoints may not be adequately represented, leading to dissatisfaction among voters. Additionally, the two-party system often fosters extreme polarization, with parties becoming more ideologically rigid and less willing to compromise. Finally, passing significant legislation can become challenging in a two-party system, as the split electorate necessitates high level of political equity to achieve major policy changes. In the history of USA, leaders also left an enduring mark on American politics, shaping the ideologies of their respective parties. Alexander Hamilton, a key founder, advocated for a strong central government and formed the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, championed states' rights and agrarianism, laying the groundwork for the Democratic Republican Party. Andrew Jackson's presidency marked the rise of populism and reshaped the Democratic Party. Abraham Lincoln solidified the Republican Party's commitment to abolitionism and civil rights during the Civil War era. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal policies defined modern liberalism within the Democratic Party. Ronald Reagan's focus on conservatism shaped the modern Republican movement, and Barack Obama's presidency emphasized progressivism and social liberalism within the Democratic Party. In the 2024 US election, two major contesting parties are the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is often referred to as the GOP. This abbreviation stands for Grand Old Party. Its logo is an elephant. The Republicans broadly advocate for traditional values, a low degree of government interference, and large support of the private sector. The Democratic Party, whose logo is a donkey, generally represents left-leaning, liberal, and progressive ideological values, thus advocating for a strong government to regulate business and support for the citizens of the United States. The Democrats believe that a prominent and powerful government can ensure welfare and equality for all. In the presidential election 2024, the Democratic Party is represented by incumbent President Joe Biden, who is being challenged by his Republican rival, former President Donald J. Trump. Today we are joined by Dr. Manisha Sinha, who will share insights on the origin of two-party system in the US and how it operates. Dr. Sinha is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut. She received her PhD from Columbia University and has previously taught at the University of Massachusetts for over 20 years, where she was awarded with the Chancellor's Medal, the highest honor bestowed upon a faculty. She is the author of two critically acclaimed books, The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in Antebellum South Carolina, and The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talks, ma'am.
Thank you, Heena.
So the US presidential election is set to take place in November. We understand it's a longer process, but the results will be out on 5th November 2024. And we see a two-way contest between the Republican Party candidate, former President Donald Trump, and the Democratic Party candidate, the incumbent President Joe Biden. Are these the only two candidates in this election? And are these the only parties that are, in the contest? Why just two? How have we hear a lot about the two-party system in US. Can you please shed a little light on how this system emerged in US and whether it's enshrined in the Constitution or has it been, is there a resolution of Congress that adopts the system, or what is it like?
Yes. So, the United States has a very interesting political system because it has always had a two-party system. And there have been three party systems in the history of the United States. But when the American Republic was founded, there was nothing there in terms of parties, except perhaps for patriots who, were for the American Revolution, and loyalists or Tories who still wanted to be a part of the British Empire. And then when the Constitution was formed, you had Federalists who were for the Constitution and anti-Federalists who were against the Constitution. Now, those were not formal parties, and the founders never visualized a formal political party system. In fact, people like George Washington, the first president, warned against what he thought were factions and even the dangers of external powers, foreign powers using internal divisions within the United States to disrupt the government here. The two-party system really emerged during the presidency of John Adams, who followed George Washington. There was an opposition party that was founded around Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, both of them from Virginia. And they opposed the policies of the Adams administration and formed themselves into the Republican Party. Not the Republican Party we know today, but the Jeffersonian Republican Party, and it opposed Adams' Federalist Party. Now, by the middle of the 19th century, these party divisions broke down, and many times they broke down over the question of slavery, with many Northerners acting against Southerners and Southern slaveholders acting against Northern initiatives in Congress. So you had the emergence of another second party system, the Democrats, which is the Democratic Party still today, though it is very different in terms of its composition and its ideology and its beliefs. And the other party we don't hear about anymore was the Whig Party. And this party was the party that Abraham Lincoln belonged to, the Whig Party, the Whigs. And the differences between the Democrats and Whigs were mainly over economic issues. But that second party system broke down in the 1850s, again, over the issue of slavery. And the Whig Party sort of disappeared, and you had the emergence of other one-issue parties like the Temperance Party against alcohol. You had the Nativist Party, the Know Nothing Party. They didn't want, they were anti-immigration. But really, the party that emerged as an opposition to the Democratic Party, which in the 19th century was the Conservative Party, it was the party of slaveholders, of Northern conservatives. They were opposed by a new party, the anti-slavery Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, which was really a party that was opposed to slavery, but it was also a racially liberal party. It was the party of what was known and then as big government. They believed in big government programs and the federal government acting against slavery for infrastructure, etc. And that's the party that has continued the third party system until today. But interestingly, in the 20th century, those two parties flipped their roles. The Democratic Party became more liberal on the issue of civil rights. It got identified with government programs with the New Deal of FDR during the Second World War. And the Republican Party, which was the party of the North and the party of anti-slavery and Lincoln, increasingly became more a conservative party, a party in which many Southern segregationists who believed in racial segregation, who were part of the Democratic Party after the Civil Rights Movement, especially because of the positions taken by the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations, which were Democratic administrations in favor of civil rights, they all moved into the Republican Party. This was a conscious, quote, Southern strategy followed by the Republican Party. And we have the Republican Party today, which is the party of anti-government, which is the party which is opposed to women's rights, civil rights. It's a conservative party. Its base is in the former Confederate states in the South, the states that fought against the United States during the Civil War. So the parties have flipped role, but we still have two dominant parties, which would be interesting for people in India and other parliamentary democracies where we have very vigorous multi-party systems. We are used to seeing coalition governments. We are used to seeing regional parties. In the United States, there have been third-party challenges. You had the Populist Party that represented the interests of farmers. You had working men's parties that represented the interests of labor. You had the Temperance Party, again, for prohibition against alcohol. You had the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs, and you had the Communist Party too, though they never really ran elections the way the American Socialist Party did. But none of these parties could challenge the monopoly of the two-party system. They all came and went. Even in recent history, we've had third-party candidates. You have minor parties, even today, like the Libertarian Party, that have just come and gone. The two-party system seems to be the dominant way the United States operates. And in that sense, it's fairly unique compared to other advanced democracies in the Western world, in Asia, like India. We have this dominant two-party system.
In both the parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, there are certain procedures or features that are common. For example, the primaries, the convention, that are rather alien to us. How did they emerge? Did they begin with the Federalist, or were there later phenomena that came into existence at some point in history?
Yes, so the party conventions really develop in the 19th century. And they developed as the United States became more democratic. They removed property qualifications for voting, which were there when the American Republic was founded in the 18th century. They extended the right to vote, at least to all adult white men, many times actually taking the right to vote away from Black men, or having them meet a property holding qualification before they could vote. Before the Civil War, only a handful of New England states had Black men voting. But the party conventions developed during the second party system, really, fully. And the Democrats and Whigs would have their party conventions. And as the Democratic Party in the 19th century leaned more towards the South, they started having a rule where they said, we will choose a presidential candidate only if 2/3 of the Democratic Convention agrees to it, which means the South literally had a veto on the presidential candidate. It's a reason why slaveholders dominated the American presidency until the election of Lincoln. You had a very few Northern candidates that were elected president. But the party conventions developed mainly because of the system in the United States of an elected president. That president and what they call a system of checks and balances, where our executive branch is separated from the legislative branch, which is Congress. And then, of course, you have the judiciary with the Supreme Court, and later on with the development of the federal court system. So the system is a little different because of the elected president. And that's what has led to conventions and then later on to primaries. Even the primaries, for instance, in the South, after the rise of racial segregation and the fall of Reconstruction, which was a brief moment in which America experimented with interracial democracy and giving Black men the right to vote in the South. In that time, they would have all white primaries only in the South. So they would exclude a part of the electorate. So the electoral system in the United States has developed mainly, I think, the conventions and primaries because of the tremendous importance that we attach to the presidency. Because it's a national election, democratically elected, even though each state has its own rules for elections, it's a hodgepodge system, which many people in India would find horrifying. We are such a big, diverse country, but we have an electoral commission, we have national electoral standards. The United States is a bit of a hodgepodge system because the Constitution is so old, and as the country has democratized, we have developed, stopgap measures, informal measures, or political practices like the primaries and conventions to fill out our electoral systems that are not laid out in detail in the U.S. Constitution, which compared to the Indian Constitution is really small, with very few amendments because it's really difficult to amend the US Constitution. It's a very high bar, 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the states. It makes it difficult. So the primaries and conventions have developed more in the 20th century from the 19th century going on 20, and now we have this long sort of primary season, and then we have conventions. And this has gotten more complicated because of the influx of big money into the US Constitution. One of the worst Supreme Court decisions, and there are quite a few that have been made that have hobbled American democracy, was the Citizens United case, which allowed big money to influence American politics. There was no restraint in the amount of money that could be given. And money was regarded as, quote, free speech. It was regarded, according to the Supreme Court, as speech. So any person wants to give $1 million to someone to run for the presidency, they can. So all this has made the US electoral system of presidential primaries and conventions all the more complicated.
I want to ask you the next question in context of the present election and also elections as they, happened earlier. For American citizens, what take precedence? The individual contesting the election or the party and the ideas that they represent? Because we see that American political landscape has also been dominated by like big personality political heavyweights such as Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, John F. Kennedy, and lately Barack Obama, or to a certain extent, even Donald Trump for that matter. So, what takes precedence, and how have some of these personalities shaped the parties that they represent, like individuals having an effect on the party ideologies that they represent?
Yes, in recent history, the role of the presidency has really grown. Some historians call it the imperial presidency. The president was supposed to take the place of the British monarch when the United States became independent. But the powers of the presidency have grown, and because the president is directly elected by the American electorate, he has a certain authority, a certain political authority. The only thing that, there are certain, again, the system of checks and balances. The president appoints what we would call his cabinet, the Secretary of State, which would be like the external minister in India. He still has to get the advice and consent of the Senate or enter into a treaty with a foreign country, the administration. So there are some checks to presidential power, but presidential power has really grown. We still keep the authority to declare war and to the power of the purse, which is the budget in Congress, is particularly the House of Representatives, the lower house. But all that has changed. Some presidents have taken over power by, you can certainly with the Vietnam War and others, where they have taken over the war powers of Congress, which many people disputed, especially with the Iraq War. The president had to ultimately get congressional authorization. So the powers of the presidency has grown a lot. And I think for that reason, we've had very dominant figures in American history who have been able to shape the course of the country. Think of, as you mentioned, Abraham Lincoln or Theodore Roosevelt, FDR, or Barack Obama, all elected to more than one term as U.S. president. Trump is a bit different. He was a disruptor. He lost after his first term, which is very important to mention because he still refuses to accept the fact that he lost, which is unusual in U.S. history. We've always had a peaceful transfer of power, and except for the Civil War, we haven't had significant numbers of American citizens disputing the results of a presidential election. The president can certainly influence and has a lot of power in terms of administrative powers, certainly, but usually the president does represent a political party, and each party has a party of platform. For instance, Lincoln was elected on the platform of the non-extension of slavery, meaning contain slavery in the South, and eventually slavery will die out. FDR was elected on the platform of the New Deal, right? Where you would have government programs to alleviate the Great Depression. What's interesting about Trump and the Republican Party today is the Republican Party always had a party platform with many of its conservative goals, even though it may not have followed them once in power. For instance, fiscal conservatism, do not spend too much money on social programs, give tax breaks to the rich, thinking that the economy would grow. That was known as Reaganomics, Ronald Reagan's platform, but those led to greater deficits, actually. But even though they did not adhere to that principle of fiscal conservatism in governance, at least that was a principle they claimed to believe in. So there was a party platform. What's unusual about Trump is that when he ran for re-election in 2020, there was no party platform. The Republican Party had no policies that it put forward as their party platform, which was highly unusual. Again, a lot of things as associated with Trump, twice impeached, now a convicted felon with multiple cases against him as the former president. It has never happened in US history, even in the case of Nixon, who was pretty crooked and was nearly indicted before he resigned and was pardoned. And so we really have an unusual case with Trump where the Republican Party has become the party of Trump. They don't put forward any policies. They used to be Cold War hawks in terms of the Soviet Union, but as far as Russia is now concerned and Putin, they're very pro-Putin, and you have Republican Party politicians even making statements which would have been unheard of for earlier Republicans, that they would rather have Putin around than Democrats, whom they see as a bigger threat. So the Republican Party has gone off the rails a little bit with Trump as their leading candidate. And also with actually standing for no policy, except perhaps in stacking the Supreme Court, in taking away the right to abortion, in indulging in maybe voter suppression. They in the South, particularly, they have, or being anti-immigrant, they have taken on the nativist mantle. They have not put forward any comprehensive political program. And the Project 2025 that Trump claims, I wonder if they'll adopt it as a party platform, because last time they didn't have one, is one in which he completely wants to disrupt the United States government. He wants to virtually withdraw from NATO. He wants to follow policies that would favor Putin and other authoritarian regimes like Viktor Orban in Hungary. He wants to weaponize the federal government, to politicize the civil service, to fire law enforcement. It would really disrupt the rule of law. So most Americans now are really apprehensive because they feel in this presidential election, as in 2020, American democracy is on the line.
So, as you mentioned, with Donald Trump at the helm of affairs in Republican Party, the party seems to have gone off the rails, right? And Democratic Party has a candidate that some assume or some criticize him to be too old for this post now, right? So it feels like American voters are caught between a rock and a hard place. Are there voices in American politics who are saying that maybe the two-party system isn't good enough for us? Maybe if we had a third choice. Have there been, like, historically, have there been movements for a three-party or multi-party system? And why have they not succeeded? Like, for example, the Know It Nothing Party or the Populist Party or the Progressive Party were like major disruptions. Why were they not able to make the most out of that momentum? Or like, why have there not been more parties?
That's a very good question. The US political system, the electoral system, works on a winner takes all, you know, principle. So unlike a parliamentary democracy, where if you win certain constituencies or if you win a certain percentage of the vote, you have some representation. In the US system, like the American Socialist Party, for instance, got nearly 1 million votes in 1912 and 1920, but since their candidate lost, that was it. There were some socialist members in Congress from certain areas, from Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, and other areas. You had the Farmer Labor Party. The Populist Party also did well until it was subsumed under the Democratic Party. Similarly, the Progressive Bull Moose Party, even under Theodore Roosevelt, they couldn't get traction. We went back to the two-party system. Even today, there are some minor candidates. But in the the party, the electoral sort of system that we have, with minor parties that don't have much influence, like the Libertarian Party had its convention, no one bothered. They booed Donald Trump. Trump thought he would get their support. They didn't want him. No one even knows who their candidate is, to tell you the truth. I think the last time I remember that there was a third party candidate who had some influence was Ross Perot. But I can't think of anyone today who has that stature. But I wouldn't both sides this. Biden is old. My father served as the governor of Assam and Kashmir in a second career after his retirement. And he retired only when he was 86. And I can tell you, he was mentally sharp, acute, and the amount of political experience that he had garnered in his years really stood him in good stead. And I can say that about Biden. Biden is old. He has a stutter. And you know how it is with AI and deepfakes, videos. They have many times will concoct videos with Biden to make him seem even more debilitated than he possibly could be. I know many people who know him personally, have met him and spoken to him. Historians, he meets with historians regularly, some very good friends of mine, and they're very impressed by his sharpness and by the fact that he is completely aware of what is being said and asks really good questions in terms of looking at the threats we face today. He's had major victories in terms domestically with the infrastructure bill. The United States economy is the strongest. It's doing much better than European economies. Unemployment is low. And the Republicans have constantly been spinning this against Biden. They've been talking about inflation, not realizing that inflation in the US is amongst the lowest compared to all other countries. That because of Biden, we have managed to come back from the pandemic much better than any other country in the world. And even the China threat now doesn't look that much with their economy basically stalling. Um, and so I would say that Biden has been very underestimated. He has also built up our coalitions, the way he responded to the war in Ukraine. Biden's biggest failure, though, has been his policy to Israel. He has not been able to be flexible enough and change. Now he's gradually changing it. He's presenting plans for ceasefire. But when the Netanyahu government in Israel is being accused of war crimes by the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, the US has to change gears. He has not stopped arming Netanyahu, even though Netanyahu's government has clearly committed war crimes against international law by targeting civilian populations. And I think that is one area that is hurting him because a lot of young people, a lot of progressive people are certainly, and certainly the Muslim community, the Arab American community in this country, he's not helping himself with those groups. And even with progressive Jewish communities who are not standing behind the Israeli government's no holds barred war in Gaza. He's hurting himself there. And it remains to be seen where a handful of voters, because of the peculiar electoral college, are able to decide the fate of American democracy. Remember, in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million votes. Trump was elected because of a perfect storm of bad things happening all together. It was a lot of Russian interference and misinformation in social media. But there was also, of course, these razor-thin majorities that he got in certain swing states that made him win the Electoral College. He never won the popular vote. He won the Electoral. He was the first president to win the Electoral College after losing the popular vote by such a large margin. And that's been true of recent Republican presidents, including George W. Bush in his first election, which was handed to him by the Supreme Court because of the disputed returns in Florida, that they never win the popular vote. They just about managed to win the Electoral College. So they have perfected tactics of what I would call minority rule and concentrating in these states. I think Biden has a good chance of being reelected if he comes out a little more with the Israel situation, where he fine-tunes his foreign policy there a bit more. But in the US, we have a very bad situation where we have an entire wing of the media, Fox News and other more right-wing channels and other sort of right-wing papers that don't respect facts. They've been sued so many times. We had a controversy on electoral voting machines. there was, starting with Trump, many people, including, unfortunately, an Indian American, Dinesh D'Souza, who made up facts about electoral voting. And that company that made those machines, Dominion Voting, sued Fox News and sued these people, and they won. And Dinesh D'Souza's film has been withdrawn because it's so full of falsehoods. So we have a right-wing news system here, mainly financed by Rupert Murdoch, the right-wing billionaire from Australia, that constantly cycles misinformation. And I think a lot of the ways in which they have treated not just Joe Biden, but Kamala Harris, if you see the way they've treated her in media, very unsympathetically, making her appear like she doesn't know what she's doing, etc. That has really created a problem for the US. It's a problem for all democracies now with artificial intelligence, etc. But this misinformation and then bad actors, particularly emerging from Russia and China, who are trying to influence our elections, all that makes a difference. And the question is, can American democracy withstand that? I do feel that this is a choice between Biden and Trump, and anyone who votes for a third party candidate like Robert Kennedy, who's been disowned by his own family. I don't think that's a very nice thing, but also who comes up with conspiracy theories about vaccinations and whose brain was apparently eaten by a worm. I mean, they're just bizarre stories about him. I don't think there's actually a choice. It's with Biden and Trump, and if you don't vote, or if you vote for a third, you're actually voting for Trump. And in the United States, where engagement with politics is not as high as in India. Our voting percentages are lower than in India. In 2020, we hit nearly 60%, but that was unusual. Normally, in a presidential election, people are apathetic, 30 to 40% vote. A part of it could be they feel that they don't have a voice in the system. But I think it's really important that in this election, we realize the stakes that are there. And pretty much do what happened in the 1930s and 40s when liberals, progressives, everyone came together to support FDR. And I think we are in one of those crucial elections now.
What is also like very peculiar and strange about Donald Trump that though he is now the Republican candidate and the Republican Party has, sort of let go of its own agenda and fallen behind Donald Trump in following his lead, but he was once a registered Democrat and he also donated to the Democratic Party. So with this peculiar feature of him, I want to ask you about the how fluid is the system of membership and party affiliation in US, since there are only two parties. Is it easy for people who are voting for registered members, for contestants to move from one party to another? Have there been instances where governors, senators have switched parties? Because as you know, in India, we are quite open to embracing leaders from other parties and form governments.
Yes, in India, the switching parties happens quite often, right? Less so here. There was that one significant switch of these Dixiecrats, Southern Democrats who were segregationists and against civil rights for Black people, who switched en masse virtually from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and their voters switched with them. Uh, Trump is a lot like a lot of these billionaires who hedge their bets. Many times they are donating to both parties. He was in New York, where the Democratic Party is dominant. I'm sure it helped him to identify as a Democrat and support Democratic candidates and helped his business. And we know that businessmen in America, particularly, really try to influence elections with money. And that's very unfortunate. That's a very bad glitch in our system where we have no transparency anymore. And with the Supreme Court that gave Bush the election and Bush v. Gore establishing a really bad precedent, that instead of counting votes, the Supreme Court pretty much decided that Bush had won the election, even though he had lost the popular vote in the country as a whole. The Supreme Court Citizen United decision. So billionaires and businessmen like Trump will always contribute to both parties. Was he a real Democrat? He's always been a racist. We know that because he, in New York, his business, his real estate company, discriminated against African Americans very clearly. He called for the execution of five teenagers, Latino and Black teenagers convicted in the rape case, the famous Central Park jogger case, till finally it was shown that they were actually innocent by DNA analysis. So I don't know whether he's a Democrat or Republican. I don't even think he's a Republican because he doesn't follow the old Republican guidelines either. And that's why many staunch Republicans like Lynn Cheney, the daughter of Vice President Dick Cheney, who are very right-wing and conservative, have left the party because Trump will pretty much say or do anything that furthers his interests. I'm not sure he has the interests of any party or even the country in mind. The way he is so impressed by dictators abroad. He likes Putin. He thinks Xi is so powerful. He praised the way China put down the Tiananmen Square uprising. He praised the North Korean crazy dictator, Kim Jong-un. So, he is quite fascinated by strong men, by authoritarians in history. There was an incident where his late first wife, Ivana Trump, said that he actually kept the speeches of Hitler and kept the speech and even Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography, by him. That story was suppressed very quickly. We know his father was probably involved in Ku Klux Klan marches. So here's a person who would be the worst nightmare. He would be the kind of person that Abraham Lincoln famously warned against. He said, if our democracy, if our republic fails, it'll not be because of any external attack. It will be because of some kind of strong man, some tyrant within our system who will emerge and subvert our system. He kind of predicted this in a speech in 1837. And as a historian, when I read that speech and I saw the emergence of Trump, I'm like, wow, he was pretty prescient. But we don't know. We don't know if the institutions and the democratic system in the United States now, which is over 200 years old, and we'll soon be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 2026, whether it will hold against a second Trump term. I don't think it will. Only once in US history has a president emerged after losing an election and then won a second term, and that was Grover Cleveland, who was a Democrat in the 19th century. And he won mainly because Black people were suppressed. Their votes were suppressed in the South. He didn't really win a Democratic election. So we have to wait and see what happens. I think a lot of the bad press that Biden has gotten has been somewhat unfair. It has not been balanced. They have not been able to talk about many of his achievements. And I think when the ordinary voter finally gets to weigh things on a scale, the idea is, will you vote for Biden, who's had despite his age, has had significant success administratively, both domestically and in foreign affairs, especially in rallying the West against Putin and his invasion of Ukraine? Or are we going to have a convicted felon as the president of the United States? And that conviction, by the way, you couldn't get a job in the United States. You wouldn't meet their security clearance. Would that person become the president? The felony conviction also bars Trump from entry to many countries throughout the world, including India. India does not allow convicted felons into the country. So if he's elected president, we'd have to make an exception for him. So I think it's that is what is at stake. And I think once the ordinary voter realizes that, I'm hopeful that Trump will lose again as he did in 2018, 2020, 2022.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us. It was very enlightening for me, and I'm sure it will be for the viewers to learn about all these intricacies of the electoral procedure and